All right, there I am. Marty, thank you so much. That was an extremely kind introduction, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very sweet. And thanks to all of the organizers, Matthias, Marty, Frederick, first of all, for the wonderful invitation, but also for just assembling this terrific group of people to discuss all of these meta-philosophical issues regarding scientific realism. It's really nice to be here. It's nice to be in this group, and it's been a really stimulating 4 days, and I no doubt that will continue after lunch and into tomorrow. So I just want to thank you. We all know how much work goes into these things together. It's been really wonderful. So today, I want to use some of the meta-level thinking I've done on realism and anti-realism as a trampoline of sorts to go quite possibly more meta than I've ever gone before, at least with respect to realism. More concretely, what I want to do is reflect on the idea of stance voluntarism in this context as a springboard for saying more about the nature of epistemic stances on the sciences in particular. And this will involve, in a sense, into the realm of what one might think of as meta-stances, and so going further. Or what I'll here call worldviews, right? I'll use this term mostly in part just to avoid confusion with around meta-stances. But that's not how I'm thinking about them. I'm thinking about them as meta-stance possibilities. The term worldview is actually appropriate here. This is fitting because meta-stances, in virtue of being yet more meta, are more general, at least in the sense that I'll try to explicate more than a bit. So here's the menu for today. The sections that I'm referring to here are the sections on your handout. I hope everybody has a copy of the handout. I'm going to start with a brief recap of what I take to be the basic idea of stance voluntarism and an associated conception of epistemic rationality, which many, perhaps not everyone in this room, but many people may be familiar with. We're going to try to strike a good balance here. I don't want to give you too detailed a primer for those who are already familiar with this, but I don't want to give you hot enough of a primer if you're not familiar with this. So we're going to go for something, not too hot, not too cold, just lukewarm in a way that I will do the job for everyone familiar with. Section 2, we're going to briefly consider an objection to this and how I replied to it in the past. The objection is that the view is too permissive. And we just saw that on the slide earlier. So you think that it's just too permissive. And more specifically, that because it's permissive, it will admit stances that really shouldn't count as rational. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. I think the previous reply that I gave to that objection is correct. So thank you for that. But I've been wanting to say more about this. One things I think it would help to say more about certain motivations for stance voluntarism in the first place. And also because I think we might leverage it to consider some important issues of science and society. And it just so happens that I'm working on some of those issues now. So in some ways, this talk is weaving together some things that I've been pursuing separately, but they're all connected in my mind. And so that's why on the last page of your handout, which just gave you some of the places where I've been working on these things separately, hopefully what I say today might communicate to you how I actually see secretly, right, not on paper so far at least, how these sorts of things might be connected. So section 3 is going to be all about what I'll describe as the worldview of the modern sciences, which I hope sheds or will shed a tiny bit more light than I had before on certain motivations for stance voluntarism in the first place. And then finally, section 4 is just about one example of how this may shape our thinking about science and society, which has to do with the aims of science education and the public understanding of science. So that's the plan for today. So to begin, just a few words about debates about scientific realism, which I usually dwell on in this company, obviously, followed by a brief primer of the ideas of voluntarism, epistemic rationality. as applied to these traits. So first, realism. What's at issue between so-called realists and anti-realists about science? Well, it's all a matter of how we should interpret the outputs of our best science. Things like scientific claims, theories, and models. What kind of knowledge or warranted beliefs about the world do these things afford us, if any? In influential realism of the 1980s, these questions were commonly discussed at a fairly high level of abstraction, by focusing on very general questions about the truth of theories or the reference in theoretical terms. So realism gave positive verdicts with respect to these things, and any sort of denial of realism was thus construed as a form of anti-realism. But, and this has come up in some of the discussions we've had already, since then, I think discussions of realism and anti-realism are more nuanced in a number of ways. Here are two key examples of this. First, more recently, more emphasis has been placed on philosophy of science and practice. So people have started thinking about very specific evidential situations, techniques and methodologies, descriptions that we may take to be abstractions or idealizations or approximations. We thought about those things in context, and hence I think part of the discussion we've been having about generalism, particularism, localism, and the localism of the last couple of days. Correspondingly, it's become less clear whether and how some of these more specific aspects of theories and models that are regarded as true or approximately true. And the upshot of this, I think, has been that the relevant units of analysis for thinking about realism and anti-realism have become much smaller than a more abstract description thought of in terms of just the truth of theories or the reference of theoretical terms might otherwise suggest. So following on from this, the second key idea that I wanted to flag is how discussions of realism and anti-realism have become more nuanced in terms of the diversification of more and less selective forms of realism. So, for example, the kind of divide, vide and impera, explanationism, status, entity realism, structural realism, semi-realism. The central motivation for all of this, I think, was, of course, to give a response to pessimist induction. And in attempting to clarify what these more refined units of analysis in the debate about realism should be, I think many people found themselves giving substantially metaphysical proposals for what they are exactly. Right? So what do we mean exactly by the relevant entities, or the relevant structures, or the relevant modal properties, or the relevant laws of nature about which we might be realists? And all of this motivates, I think, a somewhat different way of contemplating debates about realism, which brings me now to the quick primer I promised on voluntarism and epistemic rationality. My last book was all about how we should think about naturalized metaphysics or scientific metaphysics or the metaphysics of science. It's unclear whether people are actually using these terms precisely or in the same way, coextensively, but I don't think they mark out any very sharp distinctions, so I'm not going to worry about that. What's at issue here, I think, is the question of what aspects of scientific claims, theories, and models we should be realistic about, and what various people here are contesting in more fine-grained ways than it was before, is the question of how far we should go in the direction of arguably increasingly metaphysically loaded ontological interpretations of our best science. At least we're thinking about that in the context of wondering about what sorts of true descriptions we can give of the world. So let me flag two things that seem crucial to understand about how far people are willing to go. That is, how to understand how different agents come to hold different beliefs about the epistemic upshot in a given part of the sciences. The first has to do with assessments of what I call epistemic risk, which concern how confident we are in judging an ontological claim to be true or false. If you think the claim that there's dark matter is especially risky, then that means that you don't feel confident in assessing the truth value of that claim, in which case you should probably just suspend judgment and remain agnostic instead. On the other hand, if you view that claim as not being especially epistemically risky, that means you have confidence in your ability to judge one way or the other based on the evidence that you have. The second feature of scientific ontology that I want to flag concerns how, in any given case, people assess epistemic risk. And here, I think what we typically find are considerations of the strength of and also trade-offs between two factors. The first I call empirical vulnerability, which is a measure of the susceptibility of a hypothesis or a claim or a theory to confirmation on the basis of the available empirical evidence. And another is explanatory power, which is a measure of the quality of the scientific explanations that are furnished by the relevant hypotheses or claims or theories of other things that we know already that we're seeking to understand them. But here's the core idea. Empirical vulnerability and explanatory power both admit of degrees. And there are serious questions here about how empirically vulnerable an ontological claim needs to be, or how compelling an explanation needs to be to lower epistemic risk sufficiently to warrant the different perceptions of epistemic risk are precisely the thing what's at stake in debates about scientific realism. And that brings me finally to the idea of epistemic stances. A stance is something that underwrites judgments about how far we should go along a spectrum of epistemic risk in making ontological commitments. It shapes our interpretations of the epistemic upshot of our society. Stance isn't, on the whole, or at all, in some cases, a claim about the world. It isn't propositional. Rather, it's an orientation, and it's made up of a cluster of values, attitudes, and commitments that incorporate strategies that are relevant to producing doxastic attitudes about putatively factual matters. And since a stance isn't propositional, it isn't something that's believed. Rather, it's something that may adopt or exemplify in your interpretations of scientific claims and theories in mind. They're the sorts of things that shape our assessments of whether an ontological claim is sufficiently supported by empirical investigation, or by explanatory power, or some combination thereof. Empirical vulnerability or explanatory power. We make that assessment when we have a sense of whether it supports an ontological claim. So the primary function, as I see it, of epistemic stances is to help agents determine where to draw lines between domains of inquiry in which belief seems appropriate and domains in which it seems better just to suspend it and remain acting students. So, for example, those who adopt what we might call a deflationary stance, which underwrites many pragmatist and neo-Kantian views of science, they typically reject realist understandings of scientific ontology, as well as the analyses of truth and reference in terms of which they're typically explicated, like correspondence truth, for example. So examples here would include logical empiricists, historicists, Kuhn, social constructivists, like the SSK law. In contrast, those who adopt what we might call an empiricist stance, which underwrites many instrumentalist type views, not all of them, but some of them, typically reject demands for explanation in terms of anything underlying the phenomena of their experience. They certainly don't think we should attempt to answer such demands by theorizing about things that go beyond those experiences. The most famous example of this, of course, we've been chatting about him, is Van Fraassing, who himself adopts a non-factive account of explanation in this context. In yet further contrast, those who adopt some version of what we might call the metaphysical stance which underwrites realist type views of different sorts, accept at least some demands for explanation involving the unobservable, and think that in some, and typically many cases, we can answer those sorts of demands successfully. And finally, voluntarism stances holds that, in principle at least, more than one stance may be rational. That is, agents adopting different and conflicting stances may all be rational, subject to meeting certain minimal conditions of rationality. Namely, conditions of logical consistency and pragmatic coherence. So an epistemic stance would be irrational if it inevitably leads to logically inconsistent beliefs. It would be irrational if it inevitably leads agents to believe things that are somehow in tension with their epistemic values. But otherwise, if a stance isn't properly described in one or both of those ways, then it's rational. And if different stances are rational, then there's a sense in which we have a choice in quotation marks, regarding which one to adopt. So I'll resist the temptation to say anything more about this now, because this was supposed to be a primer after all. So let me just now turn to the objections of this picture that I want to consider here, which I take to be an instigation to say more than we have previously about the nature of certain epistemic stances, and how thinking about them may actually be useful to us in certain contexts of science and society. Okay, section 2. So, what's the objection? It's essentially the idea that on the view I just stated, given the rather modest conditions on epistemic rationality that I've just described, even what one might call epistemically pathological stances, ones that seem obviously defective in some way, may count as rational. An epistemically pathological stance is presumably an irrational stance. It's not the sort of thing you'd want to adopt. So if, as the objection claims, stance voluntarism is conducive to this, then there's something deeply worrying about it. It's too permissive. For example, one might claim to know, not claim, and some people have claimed in the literature, that stance voluntarism opens the door to all manner of pseudosciences and forces of science denialism more generally, which, in virtue of conflicting with genuine science, have rather bad consequences for all sorts of things, right? Public health, climate, biodiversity, and so on. So to put this in the form of a reductio, accepting stance voluntarism entails that pseudoscience is rational, but that the absurd consequence of what was supposed to be an account of warranted belief about science. Now, before I consider this, let me talk about something that seems to me important to keep straight here, because I think it sometimes isn't kept straight in the area. Pseudoscientific theories, astrology, flat earth theory, homeopathy, etc. Those things aren't stances. They're bodies of putatively factual claims about the world. So the target of the concern, the target of the worry, in the first instance, must be the epistemic stances underlying those beliefs are too permissive. Now, once we take that clarification forward, the objection here must be that what we'll find upon examination, whatever stances underlie commitments to pseudoscience, is that they satisfy the voluntarist conception of rationality in terms of consistency and coherence. So, in posing this objection, this must be what, for example, Stathis has in mind when he asserts that, and I put some of the quotations and the things that are going to remember on the handout. Creationism is not self-defeating, yet it's not necessarily rational. I don't know whether there's a hint of sarcasm there, whether he's saying it's obviously irrational, but he at least wanted to affirm the print, but it's not necessarily irrational. Likewise, it must be what Ragnar van der Aarwijk has in mind when he asserts that stance voluntarism can't, I'm quoting, exclude epistemic stances of licensed pseudoscientific practices those found in Scientology. Yeah, clearly those are serious concerns. But as I mentioned at the start, I don't think that they undermine stance quality. That said, the reply that I've given to this in the past leaves more to be said, and I want to say some of those things today. So let me start with the reply I gave earlier and then take it from there. I think the devil in the details here is in working out what stances precisely actually underpin pseudoscience importance. It seems to me that often those details aren't especially easy to work out. In fact, they're often partially or maybe even substantially or wholly opaque even to those agents who adopt those stances. And so it's just too quick, I think, to simply assume sort of covertly that advocates of pseudoscience are generally consistent and coherent. On the contrary, I think it's likely that in cases of pseudoscience, other types of stances, not merely epistemic stances, are part of the equation and often produce what you might think of as disruptive interference with epistemic consideration. So, for example, someone who recognizes the importance of empirical evidence, but is committed to simply overriding that consideration whenever empirical evidence appears to undermine a favored religious dogma, such as creationism. Well, that person would appear to be using their epistemic stances with their religious stances. Based on popular reporting, at least, I have no direct familiarity with this case, but I've read about it. Something similar seems to apply to advocates of Scientology, who it seems to use their epistemic stances with, I don't know what we would call it, maybe something like their economic stances. For those of you who aren't familiar with this case, Scientology appears to be a thinly veiled sort of money-making scheme. But I was been a Scientologist for decades, so you can tell us about it.
It's not that thinly veiled. Anybody wants to sign it.
That's why you signed it. So as a result, whatever else they may do, these sorts of cases seem like strong candidates, I think, for failures of epistemic consistency and coherence. And the failures of purely epistemic rationality. And that was my reply earlier to the objection that stance voluntarism is accepting pathological standards. As I mentioned, I think that's essentially correct, but there's significantly more to say. And I wasn't really in a position to spell this out before. So what I'd like to do next is to dig into some of these issues a little bit further as I see them. Let me start with an analogy that may help to illustrate the feeling that there's something more to say. So many of you are familiar, I'm sure, with Ian Hacking's work on styles of thinking and reasoning in sciences. He was inspired by Aleister Crowley's pathbreaking work on the same topic. The basic idea is that if you look at the historical development of the sciences, it's possible to identify the advent of certain modes of engagement with the world that have sort of internal coherence. They furnish ways of thinking about how to inquire into and describe and assess claims about the world. So, for example, the taxonomic style of reasoning, something you find in biology, the statistical style that was one of his favorites. The experimental style, maybe that was his favorite. Now, some of you who were around at the time may recall that after Ian published this, people ran with that idea in all sorts of directions. John Allen, for example, argued that given Hacking's description of what a style of reasoning is exactly, medieval demonology should count as a style of reasoning. Okay, so I can only imagine that Ian was being used by this. Wakes up in the morning and gets his copy of the Globe and Mail or the Torch in Toronto, and the headline is Toronto philosopher thinks the demons are just as real as electrons. Spray them, and then and make it that work. Here's the question that I'd like to raise. What's correct for the sake of argument that medieval demonology does, in fact, satisfy the conditions that Hacking identified with styles of reasoning and figures in the sense? Would that qualify itself suggest that demonology is a scientific style of reasoning? Well, I think that the answer to that question is no. And surely it doesn't. Crombian hacking started by identifying certain styles of reasoning within the tradition of the sciences. And then they gave an account of what makes something a style within that tradition. Something that looks superficially similar, but isn't part of the scientific tradition of inquiry, it doesn't become scientific on that basis alone. So it seems the deeper question here is one of what it actually means to be part of a scientific tradition of inquiry. And in a similar vein, I want to suggest that even if what underlies creationism and Scientology and flat earth theory, and so on, superficially resemble what we might recognize as scientifically respectable epistemic stances. I don't think they do, but even if we were to grant that, that all by itself shouldn't be taken to suggest that stance voluntarism entails that they're on par with epistemic stances in the sciences. So the corresponding news headlines would be something like, Miami philosopher says that truth and post-truth are the same thing. I just got a notification in my inbox today that Raphael is written a paper about how we make stances about history. Spray truth and spray post-truth, then they're real. They're on a par. So to get clear on this, I think what we need to do is take a step back and think a little bit about the term scientifically respectable means, which may give us some clues about how forms of scientific denialism often seem to use epistemic stances with other kinds of stances. And in the worst case scenario, they simply run roughshod for epistemic considerations in virtue of more basic commitments to other kinds of stances. So let's take that step back now and think a little bit about what I and others have identified as epistemic stances relevant to the sciences and what they have in common. And that brings me to section 3. Okay, so what is it to have a scientific conception of the world at all? What's distinctive about scientific modes of inquiry and understanding as opposed to, say, artistic or literary or religious modes of inquiry and understanding? What I'd like to do next is go back to my HPS roots a little and give you a brief summary reflection on the origins and evolution of modern sciences as forms of inquiry, all with an eye sketching something that we might appropriately call a scientific worldview. So the term worldview, of course, is a term of art. It's been used in a number of ways, discussed perhaps most prominently by German philosophers in the early 20th century. The concept of Anjan was applied to shared understanding of the world, including values that informs thought and culture. So here I'm thinking about people like Wilke, Simmel, Mannheim, Rickert. And one way of rendering this traditionally is in terms of a shared set of concepts, values, and beliefs. Something that's shared, that's a product of social and cultural forces and their evolution. The one rendering in particular, I think, is especially helpful in articulating a form of voluntarism. Georgi Lukács and Karl Mannheim thought of worldviews, and here I'm quoting some nice work by Thomas Democrats. They thought of them as, quote, a priori conditions of possibility in the context of which various forms of knowledge, in the broadest sense of the term, could have emerged. They trace the outcome of intellectual production back to a worldview that is subjectively given in the totality of feelings the subject has toward the world surrounding it. So now you can probably see why at the start I said that my worldview here, I have in mind something that could be viewed as meta stance, stance that's shared by other ground level stances. I submit that all of the epistemic stances that I mentioned earlier in my quick primer, inflationary stance and empiricist stance and metaphysical stance, are all instances of a meta stance that are linked to the scientific worldview. And to spell this out a little, let me delve now a little bit into the history of ideas. The emergence of proximate antecedents in the sciences as we know them today, forms of inquiry that belong to the tradition that extends to and includes the modern sciences, is commonly associated, of course, with the scientific revolution. Whether or not you believe that's a thing exactly, but that's what the time period, overlapping with the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. And over this period, the formation of a robust conception of the sciences as something distinctive in comparison to other prior forms of inquiry was intertwined with a coalescing humanism, perspective that shapes, among other things, what we think of as a scientific conception of the world. But humanism emphasized reason and science as a basis for understanding the world in our place, and also for making it a better place. So the understanding of the world component was reflected in epistemology. And the making the world a better place component was reflected in developments in value theory. I'm just going to focus on the metaphysics. So during the Renaissance, the term humanist was applied to people who were engaged in the study of classical literature, languages, the texts, the culture, the thought of classical antiquity. During the Middle Ages, a lot of this had been lost or ignored, but a lot of this was reclaimed with the rediscovery. In fact, the act of seeking out Latin texts, people hunting through Europe to find these texts in dusty libraries. And also by the relocation to Italy of troves of Greek texts from Constantinople after it was conquered by the Ottoman Empire. So exploring these texts revealed to scholars what they regarded as kind of reverence for human dignity. And this was expressed in a number of ways. It was expressed in terms of a deep respect for human self-expression and inquiry, fueled by the application of reason. So where once deferring to, say, supernatural forces, God, revelation was a secure basis for understanding the world, there was now room increasingly for humanity itself to take the reins of inquiry and understanding, such that Protagoras' ancient dictum, which had been rediscovered during this period, man is the measure of all things, can take root in the form of a larger and more authoritative epistemological role for human beings in investigating the aspects of reality. Gathering momentum, this confluence of ideas grew and intensified, leading into throughout humanity. So, to know Copernicus, Galileo, Bacon, Newton, other natural philosophers elaborated new methodological instructions for how to inquire into natural phenomena. In accordance with their own sort of relatively recently liberated, evolving humanist conception of reason and rationality. So this is a wonderful period, and I can't talk about it that much, obviously, but there are so many fun things. Humanists rediscovered excerpts from Cicero and Plutarch that showed that ancient thinkers had considered the idea of a heliocentric cosmos. This inspired Copernicus, and then performed his own analysis of his and others' empirical data. In all of this, I think, is what we might properly recognize as a distinctively scientific worldview which persists to the present. Now, here are what I take to be the two most important elements of this worldview. The first is an essential empiricism. And by empiricism, I don't mean logical empiricism, and I don't mean constructive empiricism. In fact, I don't mean any of the technical, academic, philosophical positions that we would ordinarily teach that are narrowly fixated on human sensory modalities. So this is really, you can just insert, instead of me explicating it, you just insert the S-talk here. So what I have in mind here is a looser sense of empiricism, in virtue of which all of us philosophers of science are empiricists. Empiricism, in this sense, is just a recognition of the unrivaled potency of systematic empirical investigation, evidence, for working out, to whatever extent we can, the nature of natural and social life. which may or may not be strictly delimited by means of, in terms of the senses alone. This is what people identify, I think, with a vaguely naturalistic orientation, which was concretized initially, historically, as an endorsement of human capacities for inquiry at the expense of received dogma. Which leads me to the second core element of the scientific worldview. Some of you will know that Kant, in an essay on what is enlightenment, described enlightenment as an emergence from an immature state in which we are unable to think critically about traditional forms of epistemic and other authority. We haven't taken ownership of our reason prior to being enlightened. David Cooper calls this rational subjectivity, the human potential for rational, autonomous adjudication of truth and God. Hence what I said earlier about this containing both developments, or embrace both developments and mysticism and epistemology on the one hand and value theory on the other. So Cooper says, quoting him here, the scientific image is the paradigmatic expression of humanism. And the foremost component of this feature of humanistic inquiry, which co-evolved with the development of the sciences, is a principled openness to critical scrutiny. So naturally, the sciences, by a persistent critical scrutiny, contain the seeds of their own destruction, as well as an reformulation. That's the kind of project it is. It's constantly tempting, but driven by a relentless pursuit of more effective means of empirical investigation to undermine this rational. So, in summary, it's this combination of empiricism broadly construed and humanist critique that I take to be distinctively scientific. At the heart of the scientific worldview is a sort of humanist empiricism. But now, if you're with me so far, let me lead you down the garden path a little bit further. What I've just said immediately suggests a voluntarist diagnosis of scientific inquiry and understanding more generally. Empiricism, broadly construed, is multiply realizable. It allows for different assessments of empirical evidence and the drawing of different conclusions as a result. So, for example, consider the diversity of opinions among particle physicists regarding the Higgs boson before it was putatively detected in 2000. Or, say, the fierce debates between theoretical physicists in recent decades about whether string theory is actually sufficiently responsive to the empirical evidence to justify its prominence in research on quantum gravity. In the absence of certainties, humanistic inquiry just has no choice but to come to terms with human limitations on and epistemic fragilities that naturally produce those sorts of differences in human. And the result of this is an inherent tolerance of even hotly contested interpretations within the bounds of the science. Tolerance is also being a celebrated value of the Enlightenment. So far as I can tell, there's nothing in a scientific worldview that entails scientism, by which I mean, at its worst, an excessive confidence in the certainty of scientific knowledge. Even though, as we know, some scientists and philosophers of science are, in fact, scientists. Whenever we take ourselves to establish on empirical grounds, with good reason, the sciences are in the business of destruction, growth, and reformulation. And that is indispensable, I think, to what it means to have a scientific world. Okay, so in the last part of my talk, I want to extrapolate some of the morals of what I've just said, what I've said thus far, to illustrate how meta-level reflection on debates about scientific realism has, or should have, I think, significant implications for various issues of science and society. And in just the way that stance voluntarism may transform how we think about realism and anti-realism, it should also transform how we think For example, and this is the specific example that I'm going to focus on here, how we think about science education and the public understanding of science. Needless to say, the uptake of our best science in the public domain, including public policy, is a crucial factor for determining how successfully we're going to be able to tackle many of the challenges that we face. Everything from more widely distributed well-being in the form of health and economic welfare to existential crises like climate change. But the public understanding of science is one major determinant of the degree of uptake of science in society that we're able to manifest. And science education is a major determinant of what later manifests as the public understanding of science. So I want to focus on education. What should we aim to achieve in teaching science? Science education, like most education, has multiple aims. So we may want to instill an appreciation for an understanding of the subject matter. We want to develop certain skills, thinking, analysis, and so on. Science education in particular, though, seems especially contentious regarding epistemic things. And that's what I want to focus on. I'm going to consider this in a very specific geographical context rather than what we call a general science education, which is the sort of basic introductory exposure to the sciences that for most people will run its course in sort of secondary school or perhaps in earlier stages of a post-secondary education. And the reason for this focus is that a general science education is all that most people will ever receive in terms of earlier exposure. But I'm focusing right on introductory exposure of this sort is all that a majority of the adult members of our societies will actually ever receive. And so it inevitably has some impact on public understanding. Now, in some domains of education, the epistemic status of the relevant content is just uncontroversial, right? So the mathematical facts of the matter concerning arithmetic and algebra and geometry and calculus aren't really up for grabs. But in domains where interpreting evidence requires non-deductive, non-algorithmic inferences in order to generate conclusions of concern, the status of those conclusions is inevitably less secure. Of course, that's often unproblematic. We don't need to worry about it in all cases. So competing interpretations of works of art, for example, or of music or literature, that's just part of the celebrated richness of those disciplines. No one is too concerned about that. But when it comes to at least some areas of the sciences, the situation is less clear. But scientific investigation is often touted as our preeminent area of inquiry into facts like natural and so forth. And yet, in our area, as you know, the sciences are also subject to significant, sometimes widespread forms of skepticism. So in the table, on your handout for this section, I've broken down what I take to be two families of positions with respect to the epistemic upshot of the sciences. What I'm calling, on one hand, on the left-hand side, ideological resistance, and on the other hand, on the right-hand side, epistemic dissensus. Both of these things complicate the task of specifying what the primary epistemic aim should be for a general science education. So let me take them each. So the first camp was ideological resistance to science. These are forms of skepticism commonly identified with the phenomenon of science denialism generally, but they have quite different profiles otherwise. So let me just consider them in just a moment. In the second camp, there's the epistemic dissensus regarding our best science, and these are positions that are fundamentally different, I think, from forms of ideological resistance, in the sense that the views comprising the epistemic dissensus are not properly understood, at least not in straightforwardly, as denialists about the epistemic status of scientific description. On the contrary, each of them identifies the outputs of our best science modeling with some or other positive epistemic status. Of course, they do that in rather different ways. So these are views that are held by people who, one way or another, subscribe to a scientific worldview, even though they don't endorse a face value, unqualified, or uncritical interpretation of scientific models and theories. There are epistemologies of science that couch positive epistemic or the positive epistemic status of our best science in qualifications and equations of a literal truth of at least some of those scientific practices. So let's begin with the broad category of ideological resistance. Pseudosciences like astrology and creationism are typically described as non-scientific doctrines or practices that masquerade as science on the basis of some misleading characterizations of their investigative methods and their analytical methods. Anti-science is a term I'm using as a sort of catch-all for all forms of trenchant opposition to science, sometimes but not always involving the promotion of pseudoscience. So the hallmark of anti-science is the pursuit of non-epistemic claims, like social or economic, that might otherwise be hindered by evidence. So homeopathists, for example, might seek to profit at the expense of genuinely efficacious treatments, meaning placebos affect society. It's actually kind of a complicated case, isn't it? And likewise, the tobacco and the fossil fuel industries have famously promoted misleading research and quotation marks to undermine facts about the harms of secondhand smoke and climate change, respectively, established by the relevant sciences. Rounding out this side of the table, resistance to facts is a term that you may have heard sort of recently come to prominence just to denote the intriguing social phenomenon of generic disinclinations for whatever reason to accept evidentially well-supported facts. So consider, this may be an instance of the anti-vaccination. Okay, let's turn to the right-hand side now, and the dissensus of what I think of to be credible accounts of the epistemic upshot of our best science. As experts in scientific realism, this will all look familiar to you, of course. So here we have a variety of positions reflecting evaluations of scientific practice and scientific claims made by philosophers, historians, sociologists, and other scholars of the sciences, including, of course, scientists themselves. These are all interpretive proposals for how best to understand the actual content of our best science. But for reasons you know very well, there's ample debate and dispute about which of these interpretive proposals is in fact the best. And what marks a very substantial difference between the current landscape of realism and anti-realism, and was more prevalent in the 1970s and 1980s, is that now controversies between different sorts of realists, and perhaps even between different sorts of anti-realists, are probably at least as contentious, if not more contentious, than controversies between realists and anti-realists. There's a spectrum of positions that cross the boundaries of the previous, more coarse-grained distinction between realists and anti-realists. So let's just have a quick look at those. As we know, proposals for selective realism suggest that, well, some parts of our best theories and models may be apt for skepticism, others are justifiably believed. But advocates of these views disagree about what qualifies for skepticism and what qualifies for belief. Different forms of empiricism, instrumentalism, also limit what they take to be believed different ways. Sometimes disagreeing about where precisely the line can be drawn between what's observable and what's not, or sometimes whether on the right sorts of circumstances claims about some strictly unobservable things may qualify for belief after all. So people use them instrumentalism, like Carl or Joe or Neo-Kantian, some of which are empiricists, hold that our knowledge of the world is unavoidably permeated with specifically human concepts and categories, and thus they take many scientific claims to be in various ways conventional, not restricted from mind independent reality. And finally, the remainder of the table, there are positions that many, depending on how they're specified in details, fall on either side of this divide between ideological resistance and epistemic dissensus. So pragmatists articulate the notion of having justified beliefs in terms of their utility, and usually skeptical about the idea of mind independent truth. But in some incarnations, that's entirely compatible with realism, but at least some scientific. But conversely, in other incarnations, it takes the form of thoroughgoing anti-representationalist. on which science itself is sometimes regarded as something like an ideology. Social constructivism is also a broad term that ranges from versions that simply consider ways in which social and economic and political relations shape scientific beliefs. From that to versions that go further, deflating the epistemic status of scientific descriptions entirely into social statuses. And finally, people with considerable local or contextual expertise, including, for example, indigenous peoples in various parts of the world, are often attuned to natural and social phenomena in ways that professional science just isn't. Sometimes this results in conflict between the two, which may play out as part of an epistemic dissensus on the right side, or in some cases it plays out as a rejection of science altogether. Now, I appreciate that I've thrown a lot at you into one small table, but even so, let me now invite you to step back from it and consider, in light of all of this, what the epistemic aims of a general science education could be. What I want to suggest to you is that the answer to that question isn't obvious. On the one hand, all of the positions on the right side, comprising the epistemic dissensus, are serious attempts, I believe, to interpret the epistemic upshot of the sciences, and all from the perspective of a genuinely scientific world. But they don't agree about what constitutes epistemic. On the other hand, the positions on the left, comprising ideological resistance to the sciences, clearly do not adopt a scientific worldview, and in various ways that fail to take seriously assessments of epistemic warrant offered by whatever rational epistemic stances may be available on the right. They either dismiss those epistemic stances or they conflate them, as I mentioned earlier, with other non-epistemic stances in ways that produce beliefs that deviate from those that are compatible with science. So now, imagine the challenge facing educators confronted by students whose antecedent commitments span the entire range of this statement. Grappling with an epistemic consensus is challenging enough, but grappling with positions that are incompatible with the scientific worldview on top of that takes the challenge, I think, to a whole new level. It's not uncommon, for instance, in cases of ideological resistance, for people to present with deeply entrenched background commitments that are simply incompatible with any sort of pro-attitude towards the science. Sometimes these commitments are driven by things like group identity commitments that then become central to self-identity. And with all the evidence and reasoning in the world, there are just limits to our powers to persuade. What I want to suggest here is that thinking about stances can help us by helping us to clarify commitments, values, and orientations that shape people's beliefs. That's exactly what we need to do, for instance, in answering the question, what should be the epistemic aim of a general science education? Now, actually, as it happens, I have an answer to that question. Well, look at the time. Obviously, I can't give you that answer now. I'd be happy to give it to you later. But I guess the thing that I want to stress in closing here is that the answer, this is a bit of a tease, which I would tell you the virtues of my lecture without actually doing it to you. The answer, the desideratum for a good answer to the question, what the epistemic gains of the science education regime, is that one, it should respect, as I think we have no choice but to do, the epistemic agency of those who manifest ideological resistance. Ultimately, we can't force them to believe anything. So there's a sense in which we have no choice but to respect their epistemic agency. And perhaps for principal reasons, we should respect their epistemic agency. But we also have to respect the hard-fought differences of opinion among those who exemplify a scientific worldview, but in different ways. And that's the right-hand side of the table. So as I said, I'd be happy to talk more about this later. But the way I think we need to think about this problem is in terms of taking the stances of people, both epistemic and otherwise, seriously, and thinking about how to confront these sorts of challenges in the world of science education. Okay, thank you very much.